Welcome back to Historical Context, where today we continue our pre-Jamestown colonization unit. And today we're going to talk about a little place known as the Ajacan Mission. And it's interesting that the pronunciation, based on what I read, is Ajacan, but it's actually spelled Ajacan. And this mission came about by the Spanish as a colony, and it kind of matches where we left off in our last episode, talking about Menendez as this diplomat starting these Jesuit missions in Florida. And as the French get pushed out of the New World, or at least of southeastern United States, by the Spanish continue to expand their missions throughout the southeastern United States. They start a Jesuit mission near modern-day Mound Key, Florida, which is close to Fort Myers. They also start putting up outposts in eastern Georgia, cutting north. They build at Santa Elena, which we briefly talked about. That's the previous site of Charles Fort. And most impressively, Juan Pardo, who was an explorer, actually led an expedition into the interior of North Carolina and established a fort, Fort San Juan, that was in western North Carolina. And this was in an area visited by De Soto nearly a quarter of a century earlier. And that ended up being one of the furthest inland and one of the furthest northerly spots established by the Spanish during the pre-Jamestown era. So the Spanish are in North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Florida. They're really starting to take a hold of what is the lower 48 states. Meanwhile, in Spain, Philip II is having some issues, mainly with the Protestants. In 1566, the Dutch revolt broke out in the modern-day Netherlands, and that was mainly tied to the Reformation. And so in Spain, things are beginning, I wouldn't say necessarily to unravel, but there are so many challenges that it's becoming difficult to manage anything going on in the New World. Back in America, Juan Pardo leaves Fort San Juan in western North Carolina to suppress a French threat that got renewed at Santa Elena. Then he returns and establishes other small forts near the area before going back to Santa Elena. So now in North Carolina, you've got multiple little sites set up that are all Spanish. Now, Fort San Juan ends up being destroyed by the natives, and there was only one survivor, and this individual survived by hiding. So eventually, things in the North Carolina wilderness got a little too difficult for the Spanish to manage. So you have the Spanish and the natives of North Carolina effectively not getting along. Enter Don Luis. Don Luis was a native youth who was captured by the Spanish during an expedition up the Chesapeake Bay in 1561. So this was pretty far north. Don was transported to Spain, where he personally got to meet King Philip II. He then went to Mexico City, where he was baptized and received a Jesuit education. So Don Luis was a native, born a native, but became essentially I don't want to say Europeanized, but he got a European education, baptized, religious education, and 5 years after his capture in 1566, Don Luis accompanied an expedition sent by Pedro Menendez to the Delmarva Peninsula, which is today known as Delaware, in an attempt to establish a colony. So Don Luis, being from the area, they felt he would be a good guide. It was believed that the Chesapeake Bay was an opening to the fabled Northwest Passage, essentially being a body of water that ultimately led to Asia. The colony in Delaware failed due to a storm, very similar to a previous Spanish colony in Florida. After the colony failed, there was no additional attempt to colonize the region for another 4 years. Then in 1570, a Jesuit preacher named Juan Segura, living in Havana, wanted to start a Jesuit mission in the Chesapeake Bay area. Father Segura did not want a military presence at the mission because the military had gained a reputation for abusing the natives. Segura felt that without a military presence, the mission could convert the natives to Christianity much more effectively. Segura's plan was unconventional. Missions up to this point had a military presence and had Spanish colonial protection. But nonetheless, he was approved to start his mission. So he would go outside of the current range area of missions and do so without any protection. With Segura was Father Quiros, who led a Jesuit college amongst the Moors in Spain. There were also 6 other Jesuit brothers and Don Luis, who was to serve as a translator and a guide, and finally a 10-year-old boy named Alonso de Olmos, whose job it would be to serve Mass. On September 10th, 1570, the party landed at the mission site on the Chesapeake Bay. A letter was written 2 days later, and in the letter we read the following. We find the land of Don Luis in quite another condition than expected, not because he was at fault in his description of it, but because our Lord has chastised it with 6 years of famine and death, which has brought it about that there is much less population than usual. So a famine and drought is present in the area. And what we've learned from history is that typically is not good for relations in the region. Segura and Quiros go on to make a request and a prediction. Let's have a look. I am convinced that there will be no lack of opportunity to exercise patience, and to succeed we must suffer much. But it has seemed good to expose ourselves to that risk, and this especially so, since in your kindness you might be able to send us a generous quantity of corn to sustain us, and to let all this tribe take some for sowing. So they're requesting food for not only themselves but the native population there. The letter goes on to mention Don Luis and his work thus far. Let's have a look. Don Luis has turned out well as was hoped. He is most obedient to the wishes of Father and shows deep respect for him, as also to the rest of us here, and he commends himself to you and to all your friends. The group constructed a small wooden hut with 2 rooms, one for living in and the other for Mass. The account now of the remainder of the mission is told by the 10-year-old boy Olmos, and he tells this story to Juan Rogel. You may remember him from last week's episode. He ends up accompanying Menendez to his 3rd trip to visit Chief Carlos. Juan Rogel ends up writing Olmos's account of what happened after the letter went out. And so we will read more into that here shortly. But not long after the ship left, so the ship leaves with the letters on board, it's only been a couple of days, Don Luis abandons the mission. And it's likely that he went to look for his family because, again, they're in the area that he was born and raised. Weeks passed before the missionaries actually began to believe that Don Luis had abandoned them. This whole time they thought he was going to get some help or going to get somebody or going to do something, but now it's becoming clear that he has left them. Over the winter, the missionaries bartered with the natives, but there was very little food and no supply ships scheduled to come. So things got rough rather quickly. In February of 1571, Father Quiros and 2 others went to the village where it was believed Don Luis was to beg for his return. They were able to get food, but not Don Luis. However, on the way back, let's have a look at the writing. Don Luis went out to the 3 who were returning home with other Indians, and Don Luis gave Father Quiros an arrow through the heart, and there they killed the 3. And then he went to the town where the fathers were, and they killed the 5 that remained. And Don Luis himself was the one who gave the first wounds with a machete, and he finished killing Father Baptista with an axe. And then those who came with him finished killing the others. So the whole situation has gone from a mission to a massacre almost immediately. And Don Luis appears to have been the architect behind that. The boy, Olmos, was the only person who was spared. And Don Luis ends up sending Olmos to the chief to get corn. And the chief, realizing what had happened, ends up requesting that the boy stay with him. The chief was concerned about the boy's safety, as I think anybody would be under those circumstances. In 1572, a supply ship came to the mission. They were attacked by natives in canoes who were dressed in clerical garb. So you can imagine the reaction when you come into port and you see these natives and they attack you wearing clerical garb. They repelled the attack and were actually able to take some natives captive. The captured natives told the Spanish of the massacre. The group leaves with the captured natives, only to be told by the captives later that the boy, Olmos, had actually survived. And so the Spanish return in the summer of 1572 to rescue him. They end up trading some of their native captives in exchange for the boy. The boy then goes on to tell Juan Rogel his story. When Pedro Menendez, and we remember Pedro Menendez from the last couple of episodes, when he hears of this, he sends armed forces to the region to capture Don Luis and his 2 brothers who were believed accomplices in the killings. They end up killing 20 natives, 8 by hanging, but they never found Don Luis. Menendez returned to the region in 1573 to do additional exploring, but the Spanish never attempted to colonize the region again. So here is a sad story about Jesuit missionaries wanting out of good faith to establish a mission without a military presence to tend to the natives in the Chesapeake Bay, and sadly it ends in tragedy. Now Don Luis, even though he isn't found, may come up in our stories later on. So it's a sad ending to the Ajacan Mission. The Spanish, to my knowledge, never go this far north again. And now a new country enters the fray, interested in America and interested in colonizing in the New World. And that is the English. And we'll talk about that next time. on historical context.